Hello friends, welcome once again to my audio tutorial. My name is Harshit Dwivedi and in today's audio tutorial we will discuss the Government of India Act of 1919. Previously in the last audio tutorial I told you about the features of the Indian Council Act of 1909. There was one important point that I missed in my previous audio tutorial regarding the Indian Council Act of 1909. That was that through the Indian Council Act of 1909, Indians were for the first time associated with the Executive Council of the Governors and the Viceroy. That is, association of the Indian persons was started with the Executive Councils of the Viceroy and the Governor. And the very first Indian, it is a very important GK question, General Studies question, that the very first person or the very first Indian who joined the Viceroy's Executive Council as a law member, his name was Satyendra Prasad Sinha. I repeat, Satyendra Prasad Sinha, spelling Satyendra, Satyendra Prasad, Prasad, and after that Sinha, Sinha. So he was the first Indian to join the Viceroy's Executive Council as a law member. So this was the point that I missed in my previous audio tutorial, and this was a feature that was included in the Indian Council Act of 1909. Now I will come to Government of India Act of 1919. Now, by 1915, British government started realizing that it would be not possible for the British government to continue ruling India for a very long time. They knew that sooner or later they have to leave India. So, formally, on 20th of August 1917, the British government declared that its objective was the gradual introduction of a responsible government in India. When the provisions of the Government of India Act were released in 1919, actually they came into force in 1921. This Government of India Act of 1919 was made under the then Secretary of State, who was Lord Montague, and the then Viceroy of India, who was Lord Chelmsford. I repeat, the then incumbent Secretary of State, whose name was Lord Montague, spelling Montagu, and the then Viceroy of India, whose name was Lord Chelmsford, spelling Chelmsford, Lord Chelmsford. So, this act is also famously known as Montagu-Chelmsford reforms. I'm sure that in some form or the other in our basic level studies or CLAT students who are preparing for legal aptitude, or sometimes in the newspapers also, the history newspapers also, and if you are a regular reader of the Hindu newspaper, in the editorial, or the Statesman newspaper or the Tribune newspaper, or maybe sometimes in Times of India it's very rare that these sorts of news are there, but in these paper we very frequently see the use of this word Montagu-Chelmsford reforms. So this Government of India Act of 1919 was also known as Montagu-Chelmsford reform. Now point wise, I will tell you the most important features of the Government of India Act of 1919. Decentralization up to a very high extent was made through this act. Through this act, the control of the Central Legislative Council over the provincial legislative council was relaxed up to a high extent, and the subjects on which the central legislative council can make decisions and the provincial legislative council can make decisions were demarcated and differentiated, and they were put under different lists. The provincial government were also given the authority to enact their own budgets. That is, the central budget was separated from the provincial budget, and the provincial legislative council got the power to discuss their own financial statement and enact it. This was one big facility, and which was one big step towards decentralization, because this was directly related to money, finance. Financial assessment was always the property of the British Crown or the British government or the East India Company previously, but now for the first time, as there was non-official majority in the provincial legislative council, and when the provincial legislative council were given the power to enact their own budgets, it was a very big and a very huge step towards decentralization of powers in India. And this step brought the Indians very close to the lawmaking process of their own country. The second feature of this Government of India Act of 1919 was that it introduced a dual scheme of governance in India, which was also famously known as diarchy. Diarchy, spelling is D-Y-A-R-C-H-Y. I repeat, D-Y-A-R-C-H-Y. It was a Greek term which meant double rule. This experiment of diarchy was not successful. Now I will explain you what this diarchy meant. First of all, I would like to tell you that this system of diarchy was applicable to the subjects mentioned in the provincial list. So the subjects that were mentioned in the provincial list, they were being categorized and differentiated into two different lists. The first was the list of transferred subjects. The second was the list of reserved subjects. I repeat, all the provincial subjects or all those subjects on which the authority of legislation was vested in the provincial legislative council, those subjects were further divided into two lists. The first was the list of transferred subjects. The second was the list of reserved subjects. Now, the transferred subjects were to be administered by the governor. The transfer subjects, the legislation on transfer subjects was made by the governor, and the governor was being helped by the ministers, who in turn were responsible to the legislative council. That is, the subjects that were mentioned in the transferred subjects list were administered by the governor with the help of the ministers, which in their turn were responsible to the legislative council of that province. Coming to second, it was the list of reserved subjects. Now the difference between transferred and reserved subjects was that all the subjects or topics that were mentioned in the list of reserved subjects, they were to be managed and administered by the governor and his executive council, and there was no interference of the legislative council in terms of legislation over the reserved subjects. It means that the sole power of legislation on reserved subjects was vested in the governor and his executive council, and they were not responsible to the Legislative Council of that province. So this was basically a double system of government in which there were two lists, list of transferred subjects and list of reserved subjects. But as I already told you, this system of dual government was not very successful. It was a huge flop, you can say. So coming to the third characteristics of this Montague Chelmsford reforms was that a new Indian High Commissioner office was opened in London and a new High Commissioner was appointed to it, and many powers of the Secretary of State of India was vested in the High Commissioner of India. That means, as today we know that in every country there are embassies of other countries, and in those embassies there is a High Commissioner or an ambassador who represents a certain country in another country. So this act created a High Commissioner's office for India in London, and a High Commissioner was appointed, and many powers of the Secretary of State of India were vested in the High Commissioner of India. The fourth important feature of the Montague Chelmsford reform or the Government of India Act of 1919, out of the 6 members of the Viceroy's Executive Council, we know that the Viceroy's Executive Council had 6 members. So out of those 6 members, this act said that 3 members should be Indians. But it also made a limitation that out of those 3 members, no member can be the Commander-in-Chief. That is, the Commander-in-Chief that was present in the Viceroy's Executive Council cannot be an Indian. So, 3 of the 6 members of the Viceroy's Executive Council were Indians, but none of them had the authority to become the Commander-in-Chief. Next most important characteristic of the Government of India Act of 1919 was that the principle of communal representation, that is the principle of separate electorate, was now not only limited to the Muslims, but it was also given to Europeans, Indian Christians, Sikhs and Anglo-Indians. That is, now the principle of separate electorate was being provided not only to Muslims but also to Indian Christians, Sikhs, Anglo-Indians and Europeans. The next important feature of this act was that provision of setting up Central Public Service Commission was made through this act. This act provided for the establishment of a Public Service Commission. Hence, the first Public Service Commission was set up in India in 1926 for recruiting civil servants who can help the government in order for smooth functioning of the administration of India. Direct elections were for the first time introduced in the country. We can also say them bicameralism. Now, many of you would be thinking, what is bicameralism? So, we know that the Viceroy of India had an Indian Legislative Council. Now, bicameral system means that Indian Legislative Council was replaced by a bicameral system of legislature. Now, that bicameral system of legislature consisted of 2 bodies. The first body was the Legislative Assembly, that was also termed as the lower house. The second body was the Council of States, that was also termed as the upper house. It means that there was initially one single Indian Legislative Council. Now that Legislative Council, Indian Legislative Council of the Viceroy, was removed and it was replaced by a two-horn system of legislature, which we also say as the bicameral form of legislature, in which two different bodies were there. The first body was the Legislative Assembly, also known as Lower House, and the second body was Council of State, also known as Upper House. Most of the members of both these houses were chosen by direct election. However, I will also tell you the strength of both of these houses. The first house, that is the Legislative Assembly, which was also known as Lower House, consisted of a total of 144 members. Out of those 144 members, 40 members were nominated and 104 members were elected through elections. And the tenure of these members was for 3 years. Coming to the second body, that is the Council of States, also known as the Upper House. There were a total of 60 members in it, out of which 26 were nominated and 34 were elected through elections. The members of the Council of States, that is the Upper House, had a tenure of 5 years. Now, all these acts were very important as a considerable amount of change was made into the system of administration of India. So, due to a huge amount of changes in this particular Government of India Act of 1999, British government thought that regular assessment of the provisions of this act have to be made. That is, that how the provisions made under this act are responding to the current scenario. This has to be checked by an independent commission. That is why the British government appointed a Statutory Commission, which was entrusted with the job of inquiring into and report on its working after 10 years of the coming of force of the Government of India Act of 1919. That means that the British government appointed a Statutory Commission who will look that how the provisions of the Government of India Act of 1919 are implemented and what are their outcomes, so that after every 10 years an assessment can be made that whether the provisions that are being made are making a positive effect or not. So with this, I wrap up this audio tutorial of Government of India Act of 1919. I know this audio tutorial was a bit complex one and there are many features. So maybe you have to listen this audio tutorial for 5 to 6 times. And I am making my audio tutorials of very small duration, of around 7 to 8 minutes. Some audio tutorials are also of 15 minutes. A very few will be of 30 minutes. The reason for my making audio tutorials this much short is that if I am going to make long duration audio tutorials, suppose if I make an audio tutorial of 2 hours or 3 hours, then it becomes boring for guys to listen it and we literally start sleeping in between. So I am making audio tutorials topic wise, so that if you've read Pitt's India Act of 1784, you know about Pitt's India Act of 1784, and also that the audio tutorials of only of 8 minutes or 10 minutes or 11 minutes. So you can listen this audio tutorial in your leisure time. You don't have to take out 2 hours out of your time schedule and listen to it. Only 10 minutes are required. So even if you are on a gap or even if you are at a bus stand waiting for a bus, and if you have a 3G connection in your mobile or even a 2G connection, you can plug in your headphone and listen to it. It's very simple. Many of you would be doing jobs, so you don't get enough time. So everybody of you have a smartphone. You have a headphone, you have internet connection in your mobile phones. You can just plug in the headphone and listen to all of these audio tutorials. Please don't purchase any of these audio tutorials. I am the owner of these audio tutorials, and I, Harshit Dwivedi, is making available these audio tutorials totally free of cost. You don't have to pay anything for this. This is an initiative from my side to help you guys so that you can make study more interactive and easy for you. And maybe you can say digital also. So thank you guys for listening this audio tutorial. In my next audio tutorial, I will tell you about the provisions that were made in the Government of India Act of 1935. And after that, I will tell you about Indian Independence Act of 1947. So friends, goodbye. Harshit Dwivedi is saying goodbye to all of you. Have a good day. Thank you. Hello friends, welcome once again to my audio tutorial. My name is Harshit Dwivedi, and today